Housekeeping items. Am I on?
Test.
I am on. That's the way. Or you cough and then it scares everybody. Just a couple of housekeeping items I'll probably mention again during the sermon as well. Today is a busy day. Number one, had I known that so many would take today off to get sick, I wouldn't have told anybody that we're having picture day today and just said, all right, we're here, get ready. But remember, today is picture day. We're going to try to just kind of update as many folks as we possibly can and update our board, Lord willing, fairly soon, and update our directory as far as photos go, and hopefully information as well. Because people's numbers may change, people's emails may change, people may move around in town and have different contact info that we need to set up. And that will lead into, so remember, today after services to about 1 o'clock, we've got 4 servants here who are going to be taking photos. And then again from about 4 to 5 is what the email said, 4 to 5. Again, for those who were not able to be here after morning services. So keep that in mind, and please be here for that. It just takes a moment of your time, and again, there's a lot more going on in the background than what will take for you to go and smile for our family. Now, attached to that is a Light Post 101 course at about 5 p.m., where here in the auditorium, I will be showing you the app on screen and showing you, number one, what we use it for and how it helps, and number two, how to use the app, because it is something that we have talked about, it's something that we've pushed, it's something that we've encouraged, and there are a whole lot of folks that are on it, and there are a whole lot of really neat things about it that have helped encourage our family here. And for those who may have been just a little standoffish about it or a little frustrated with it, I'm hoping that this will at least alleviate some of those frustrations in trying to work the app and everything like that. Number 3, as you can tell, I'm not Andy. About 8 months ago, I got a phone call from the elders asking if I'd be able to fill in right after, I believe it was right after I was hired. I think it was right after I was hired, yeah. And I said, not a problem. Apparently, quite a few folks had come down with the disease, which may not be named, and after coming back from a wonderful camp experience. And so I came down and did that. Well, unfortunately, again, like I said, there's quite a few folks that are out probably with allergies, colds. We forgot that other things exist outside of the last 2 years, but people get sick. And so today it will be different than what you saw in the bulletin as far as the sermon sheet goes, as well as the class here. We are going to be going over what we've been studying in the other adult class in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So if you want to be turning to 1st and 2nd Samuel, that is where we will be this morning. Now, and then fourth and finally, if you see me take a sip of water, please forgive me. I'm still learning about all the allergies that are here, and it's a fun experience. And I've been told that this is starting to be the time that allergies start. I've also been told that they don't stop. So we'll see how it goes. As we begin this morning, this time of Bible study, let's have a word of prayer. Our God in heaven, we are thankful to you for redeeming us so that we can be here on this day to praise your name together. God, we are thankful that your Son is risen from the dead and that he is seated at the right throne of heaven. And we are thankful, God, that you are in control. God, we're thankful for blessings. We're thankful for promises that you keep always. God, we ask that you would be with those who could not be with us today. Bless them. We're thankful for technology that helps us to connect when it's impossible to be in person. But God, how thankful we are when we can be together. And we ask that you would bring them back to us as soon as possible. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. 1st and 2nd Samuel is a book that breaks down in a very easy way. Again, just to kind of catch those of us up who have not been in the other class. And although you may have studied Samuel on a number of occasions in your life, it is a good reminder as far as looking at the content of 1st and 2nd Samuel and seeing it from a broad perspective. 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book. But, scrolls, they can be pretty hefty, bigger than some of the books we even have in our library. And so dividing it into a couple of scrolls definitely helped, and having a dividing section helped, but they are one book. And if you had to figure out just kind of the major message of 1st and 2nd Samuel, I believe 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7 gives a pretty good synopsis of the whole book. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. It is, as it begins, a dark time in Israel's history. We are coming off the Judges period. In fact, 1 Samuel starts in the Judges period. But it doesn't end there. But it's a very dark time in Israel. And there was barely any word from the Lord. It was such a dark time. Chapters 1 through 7 of 1 Samuel, it's that end of that era of judges, Samuel being the last major judge, and transitioning into the kings. Chapters 1 through 7, it's all about Samuel. In a way. But it shifts focus from that time of the judges to what will be the time of the kings. In 1 Samuel 8, all the way through the end of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, you have the reign of Saul, the first king of the united kingdom of Israel. You have Saul, 8, all the way through the end of the book. 2 Samuel, chapters 1 to 5, David is ruling basically Judah only. He's ruling from Hebron. And then 2 Samuel 6 to 24, David rules all of Israel. And there's a couple of different ways that we've broken it down in class, but I think, again, for the sake of timing and today, looking at those 4 big areas, it's pretty simple to break down. Samuel, Saul, David in Hebron, David in Jerusalem. Pretty easy way to break down the text. And again, the focus is that the Lord does not look as man looks. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. If you want to have a really fun study sometime, look at 1 Samuel 2. You have Hannah's prayer or Hannah's song. Hannah's song is the foundation for the rest of the book, because what she sings in that song or prays in that prayer about enemies falling before God and for the meek and the humble being lifted up by God is repeated time and time and time and time again. 1st and 2nd Samuel is also known for its contrasts. You have Samuel and Eli contrasted. Eli, a faithless priest with even worse sons, and they will be rejected. Samuel being a prophet and serving in the temple in humility, or serving in the tabernacle in humility. You have Samuel and Saul contrasted. Saul, who doesn't seem to have a spiritual bone in his body except for on a few rare occasions. And again, Samuel, who would gently lead and teach and preach. You have Saul and David and the contrasts that arise with Saul and David. You have David and Goliath. By the way, Goliath wasn't the only big giant in that chapter. You have on the other side Saul, who was head and shoulders above all people. And he was telling David he couldn't do it either. You had David's brother in another corner who said, "What are you doing here? You just want to see a battle." But David's trust was in the Lord. All through the text, you see all of these contrasts, and David would be declared as a man after God's own heart. When Saul is rejected from being king, God says, "I have sought a man after my own heart, and he will be king over my people." We are in 1 Samuel 24. 1 Samuel 24. In the last couple of chapters, several things have happened. Just to kind of give you an overview of what we've been looking at, David has had to flee Saul because Saul wants to kill David. David has been a commander in Saul's army, but now he has to flee because of Saul's jealousy and Saul's hatred and Saul's desire to be king and not have David as king. And there's a lot of family problems in Saul's family with his daughter Michal and with his son Jonathan. Jonathan is faithful to David. Michal wanes back and forth as to who she's faithful to. It's just a terrible time for Saul and his family. But you have David, who is on the run, and multiple times David will be rescued from the hand of Saul. But Saul is so destructive, and he's starting to kill priests. He is starting to threaten towns of his own people, and he is calling the enemies of the Lord his friends. Here in 1 Samuel 24, 1 Samuel 25, and 1 Samuel 26, there are three tests that take place that all really do repeat the same thing. Lord willing, we'll get through all three today. I'll ask as we begin, though, in this section, have you ever had to learn something more than once? Or do you just get it right, when you get it right the first time, you can just keep going on and you just get better and better? I remember having a math book when I was in school. Math is not my favorite subject. Lunch was, if you couldn't tell. No, I'm kidding. You have math, and our math book that we used for years and years. Of course, it was, each grade level. It was Saxon Math. Some of you even may remember that name. I see a few of you nodding your head. Saxon Math was known for one thing and one thing only: repetition. Every single chapter had 30 questions. Chapter 1, all 30 questions were what you learned on chapter 1. Chapter 2, 15 questions were what you learned on chapter 1. 15 were on for chapter 2. Chapter 3, it mathematically divided them. Chapter 4, by the time there were over 100 chapters in this book. But it was all based on repetition and the idea that you will remember based on that repeated exercise. When you learn language as a child, it is because of repetition from parents and family and friends. Repetition is the key to learning. Having that repeated exercise, and some of us sometimes we have to learn hard lessons more than once. Some of us may have been some of those kids that touched the stove more than once. But a repeated lesson is sometimes necessary. And what you have in 24, 25, and 26 for David is a repeated lesson that he must learn. David's not perfect by any means, but he is a man who loves God. And he is a man who is willing to learn and willing to change. But as you go through these, think about the repeated lesson each time. 1 Samuel 24, beginning in verse 1. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, and the men of David said to him, Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on. David, who has been hiding from Saul for a long time, has an opportunity, a prime opportunity. He and his men, over 300 it seems at this time, are hiding in a cave. And Saul needs to do what people have to do sometimes, and Saul goes into the cave for some privacy. David has every chance in the world, and he goes and he cuts off a piece of Saul's robe, and when he does so, in a way, he comes to himself. He's thinking about what he's doing, and he decides not to do it. In fact, his soldiers who were with him have said, Look, this is the day that God has given your enemies into your hand. Take it. It's the chance of a lifetime. David, we know you're supposed to be king. You've been anointed. David, we know that Saul slew his thousands, but you his tens of thousands. David, we know that you are the one who is the rightful king at this time, and yet we're hiding in a cave. A whole lot of discussion, but it didn't even take that. David, today is the day that God has given your enemies into your hand. And before David kills Saul, he says, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. See, David still saw Saul. That's hard to say. David still saw Saul as the Lord's anointed, the Lord's chosen one. And with those words, David persuaded his men that they would not at this time kill this man and kill this man who was out to kill them. And what you have with this setup and this test is a success. David does not kill him. And notice what happens as Saul goes out of the cave in verse 8. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, My Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. So notice how David spares Saul's life. And as Saul exits the cave, you have David shortly following behind him. You know, you kind of wonder if there were some of the army of Saul standing down watching Saul come out and then see another man start to come out of the cave and start to think, wait a second, we know him. And David has to call out to Saul, and Saul turns around and sees David holding a piece of cloth, and the first thing David does is bow down and pay homage. He shows that he had every opportunity, and just the whole ridiculousness of a guy coming out of a cave, and the enemy he's been seeking just comes out, says, hey, I'm right here. But what David does is he pleads using God's justice. Don't listen to wicked men. Don't listen to all these voices that are saying, I'm your enemy, what have I done? He says, I'm just a flea. I'm just this small, insignificant. I'm not your enemy. If I have done something wrong, let's let God's justice decide that. But if I have not, let's let God's justice decide that. And you have God ensuring, you have God as the one who is the focal point in David's mind. And Saul, as soon as David had finished, verse 16, Saul said, is that your voice, my son David? By the way, notice, David refers to Saul as father, and Saul refers to David as son. Notice the closeness of the relationship that they at least once had. Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be reestablished in your hand, or shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. And Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. You have a time of redemption, a time of reconciliation, although David's not going back into his court. But what you have with Saul is a recognition of God's faithfulness. And what Saul has been doing, again, consider the contrast. Saul has been violently pursuing David to kill him. And Saul is the one who says, will a man let his enemy, will a man, verse 19, for if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? This is what David does. He lets him go away safe. And so what Saul does in showing that he at this time is no longer his enemy is he lets him go away safe. But you have David sparing Saul's life. There's a test. You have every chance to kill Saul. But he doesn't, and David instead appeals to God's justice. And Saul recognizes that God is faithful and will establish his throne. What an admission from Saul. By the way, David has already promised Jonathan on a number of occasions that he's not going to kill Saul. David has promised faithfulness to Saul and his family. Will there be a change in power? Yes. But David will not kill the house of Saul. And Saul asks for another treaty or another covenant. Test number 1. David, will you take vengeance on your enemy? David trusts in the Lord. And he says no. Test number 2, chapter 25. Verse 1 is imperative to understanding the rest of the chapter, even though it kind of seems like an aside. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. So you have Samuel who has died. Just kind of an aside is almost mentioned, but it's not. In order to understand the rest of the chapter, again, David is one who is waiting to become king. David is one who was anointed by Samuel. It's not just a throwaway by the way, but it's supposed to cause us to stop and think. Samuel has been the prophet for Israel who anointed both Saul and David to be king. All Israel assembled and mourned for him. Saul has not seen Samuel for years after his blatant disobedience in chapter 15. And in fact, it's chapter 16 after that Samuel anoints David. With Samuel gone, how will David behave? Has God's promise of David becoming king failed now that Samuel is dead? Notice the first 8 verses. Then David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man of Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at your hand to your servants and to your son David." So, again, just kind of setting up what's going on here. David has protected this man. And by the way, notice how he is introduced. There was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. He was rich. He had a beautiful, wonderful wife. But he himself was a fool. That's how he's introduced. And then it says what his name is, Nabal. If you're known first by all the things that you do and then by your name, which we'll learn what that name means in a moment if you haven't looked at your little hints there in your Bible at the bottom of the page, he's first introduced just as a nameless man who's foolish. And David and his men have been protecting his sheep and his shearers, the sheep shearers and the shepherds. And again, you think about the dangerous times that they're living in. It wasn't like they had a big, long fence that protected the sheep from anything that could get in. You had wolves that could easily harm. You had thieves that would easily try to take these sheep, this livelihood. You had a whole lot of dangers. And so having the protection of David and his men was a huge blessing. And it's a feast day. It's a time of celebration. It's a time of togetherness. It's a time of gathering together to glorify God. But we're already introduced to this man and his character. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. The response to David, who you kind of have to wonder at this point, David's name is so well known that when he is in enemy territory, they sing the number one hit song. Saul slew his thousands, David his 10,000s. Is this not David? And that's when David had to pretend for the first time to be a madman. For a person to ask, who is David? Is he that uninformed? Or is he that arrogant? Or is it both? Even if he didn't know David's name, it's easy to see that these people have been helping them for some time. And again, it's a feast day, a day of togetherness and a time for God's people to come together and to glorify God. And he says, absolutely not. And David's response, what a dishonorable, horrible stink of a man. We're going to kill him and all he has. Verse 14 begins, but one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife. He says, in essence, here's what has happened. David was telling the truth. And now harm has been determined against Nabal and all his house. Pick up in verse 18, then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep, already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. David's out for blood. And by the way, the first 13 verses reiterate something that would have taken some time to do, but it does it in just 15 verses. But after that 15 verses, notice this goes all the way to 44 before getting into the next section. You have this slowdown by the author. And again, it wants you to kind of focus on these details and focus on what's going on and kind of drag out what's going to happen to Nabal and his family. You see Abigail coming in, preparing what should have been given. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. Imagine if you were born and your parents named you fool. That's what Nabal means. Folly is his name, and folly follows. This is what Nabal is all about. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek you to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. One moment. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound to the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord had dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. In the previous chapter, what is David's appeal when he comes out of the cave and talks to Saul? What does he appeal to? God's justice. Appeals to God's justice. What does Abigail appeal to? Same thing, God's justice, God's righteousness. She says, surely you will be king. But notice who she says is the one who has stopped David from enacting so far what he's planning to do. Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal, be as a fool, be as my husband the fool. But she says, do not let blood guiltiness come upon your name. Forgive the trespass of your servant. She says, when you become king, you won't have this on your conscience. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. Abigail appeals again to God's justice. Don't let this be put on your own. Don't try to make salvation for yourself. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guiltiness and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to me, truly by morning there had been not left to Nabal as much as one male. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and she said to her, go in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. Now, by all rights, David, who is the anointed one, should have been able to get this fairly small request from somebody who is just filthy rich. And this filthy rich man is filthy. He's a horrible person. And David, as king, had every right. He had every right. He had every right. And he was ready to take those rights into his own hand. In a day that should have been a feast, almost became a day of slaughter. But one woman, Abigail. Again, we're introduced to the characters of the people. You're introduced to Nabal as one who is just a terrible man, and you're introduced to Nabal as one who is beautiful in every way. Wise and understanding, patient and loving. And she says, wait on the Lord. Abigail told Nabal what had happened, and he became frozen. He drunk all night. In verse 37, in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, He said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you and to take to him as his wife." And she rose and bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, daughter of David's wife, to Paltai, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. Again, a lot going on here, but kind of thinking through some of these details. Nabal dies, and David praises the Lord for punishing Nabal by the Lord's hand instead of by David's hand. When David came to himself and called Abigail blessed, she was the one who helped him come to himself and to realize that what he was about to do was against everything that he is supposed to stand for. But it was a lesson that he learned in the previous chapter. He is not going to go against the Lord's anointed. Well, this isn't the Lord's anointed. This isn't somebody who's anything except he's rich. But David trying to bring salvation for himself, not going to work. Test number 1 is wait on the Lord. Test number 2 is wait on the Lord. Going back to the initial question about have you ever had to have a test more than once? You know, every now and then you'd get one of those tests in school and the teacher was gracious enough to give you a hint. Wasn't the Lord so gracious to David to give him a hint? To prevent him from going forward by this woman? With murdering an entire house because they didn't get to feast with them. Trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Why did Saul react to David the way he did in 24? Saul realized that David was not really his enemy. Why did David spare Nabal, who really was an enemy? It's because he realized that vengeance belongs to the Lord. It's a test case for David. Samuel's dead. This man is not the anointed. Why or when? When shall we wait on the Lord? The answer is always. God's providence isn't just about providing. Sometimes it's about restraining. Isn't that what happened here? God restrained David from murdering a man in his household. And now by this point you have Samuel, Jonathan, Saul, and Abigail all affirming that David will be king. God intercepted and encouraged David at a time where he most needed it. Look at chapter 26, test number 3. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon?" So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshurun. So again, David is fleeing from Saul because the enemies, the Ziphites, have come to Saul and saying, "Hey, why don't you go kill David?" Drop down to verse 7. David said that, and Abishai went to the army by night. And there lay Saul sleeping with the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but take now the spear that is at the head of the jar of water, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. David gets a little bit away, and Saul recognizes the voice of David. He cries out. And again, verse 21, Saul said, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. And David answered and said, here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. 3 times David is tested, and 3 times, with a little bit of help, David succeeds. The one lesson: vengeance belongs to the Lord. Wait on him. I see people starting to come in, so we will stop here for today. Next week, you'll be back in Acts, and we'll be back in there, Lord willing.